a Black labor activist and Louisville resident, instrumental in the 1927-1928 IWW strike, coal mining strike here in Colorado. Now, I'm going to stop for a second just so I can make sure I can see chat. I apologize. When I went to share my screen, it disappeared. There we go. We will be using a chat a couple different times this evening. So if you are familiar with that, you can go ahead and pop up your chat. But that's a digression. The museum has been working on an effort to better understand William Lofton's role in our city and state's history since last summer. So we first encountered him in this odd story in an unprocessed oral history that was talking about the failed arrest attempt of an African-American strike leader living in the heart of Louisville. From there, we've done a lot of digging in the intervening months, and we're happy that we've been able to uncover enough to talk about him. In fact, we're very, very excited to share what we know about William and Lillian Lofton and their family with everybody who's able to be in attendance tonight. Now, tonight's structure, I want to kind of explain, is going to be a little bit different from the article that we published on Lofton. In addition to talking about the details of Lofton's life, we're also going to dig deeper into what life was like in Louisville during the 1920s, with a special eye towards the ways that race and labor issues kind of worked together to make Louisville what it is today. In fact, tonight's talk is actually the second in a short series that we've done on the 1920s, and I will be referencing Dr. Lee Campbell Hale's presentation that she gave on the 1927 strike at the end of February. So as we go through the talk tonight, kind of a few ground rules, please feel very, very free to ask questions throughout the talk, either by using the raise hand function, at which point we will be able to unmute you and you can kind of ask a question, or by using the chat or the Q&A function here on Zoom. So if you're familiar with either of those, go ahead and use those to ask questions, or just click on the button that says raise a hand and we can mute you, and I will take your question. Do know, though, that there is going to be a formal Q&A session at the end of tonight's talk, which will be about 45 minutes. So if you want to keep your question, I can get to it then. Now, tonight's talk is going to follow this outline. We'll start with a look at the rise of the KKK in Colorado. Then I'm gonna offer a quick overview of the 1927-1928 strike. This again will kind of build on Dr. Lee Campbell Hale's talk that she gave about a week and a half ago. And from there, we'll look more closely at the life of William Lofton and his family. Now, his experience and the Loftons more broadly, I really believe helps us to understand what the decade was like in Louisville. So what those 1920s was like here, but also it's through his eyes that I think we get a much better sense of how the 1920s really set Louisville on a path to become what it is today, for better or for worse. So we get to kind of understand again through the eyes of William Lofton how race and labor are really working together in the 20s, and the legacies that intersection kind of leaves us. Now, before we kind of dive into the substance of the talk, I'd actually love everyone to do me a favor. Can you in chat, so pull up chat, go ahead and type yes or no, just to let me know if you were able to attend Dr. Lee Campbell Hale's talk on the 27-28 strike. That would just give me a chance to know where you're coming from. And while you do that, I'm going to pull up participants. Okay. So I did see some familiar names in the attendee panel, which is wonderful. Some names I saw last time. And this kind of gives me a sense. So I will be touching on kind of the overview of that talk. But I will say that if you want, and I highly encourage it, we did record that talk and you were able to see it on the museum's website, or I apologize, on the museum's YouTube channel. So I really encourage you to do that. Dr. Campbell Hale really kind of gave us a good overview of kind of both the ups and the downs of the 27-28 strike, but also why it was important. It's an often forgotten labor movement or labor experience here, and one that was pretty significant in kind of labor history and in the history of our region. Okay. Also, thanks everyone for popping on chat. Okay, now Before we dive into the rise of the KKK in Colorado, I actually want everyone to do one more thing. It's going to be a bit of an interactive experience. What I would like everybody to do is to have you sit with these two graphs for a moment. These are two pie charts depicting racial demographics today. The one on the left is of Louisville, and the one on the right is of the entire United States. Just take a moment, look at them. These graphs, they're as current as I could find. They include, or they are based on information from the US Census Bureau, their American Community Survey in 2019. And so they're fairly accurate in terms of what Louisville is like today. But what I'd like you to do is just look at them and think about what pops out to you. Does anything surprise you? Does anything maybe confirm what you already knew? Is there an element of this that you have a strong reaction to? And then once you have an observation or a reaction, I would really appreciate if everyone would just add that to chat. That would just kind of help us think about the maybe the legacies, but also the way that we live with race today. I can't thank everybody enough for kind of the comments that you're adding. And I hope, everyone can, well, the panelists can see them. There should be a way perhaps for everyone else to see chat. If you can't, I apologize. But the gist of things is for some comments, this is not super surprising. Specifically, people are kind of also noting that the Black population in Louisville is incredibly disproportionately small compared to the national population. The Hispanic Latino population in Louisville is equally smaller, but not as disproportionately so. And there's some observations that Louisville has been a rather white place, and kind of as far as identity and performance goes for some time. Now, as I looked at those two charts, as I looked at those graphs, and I kind of thought about the ways that this conversation could go tonight, my conversations in many ways mirrored some of the comments that you all had. I was curious how we can understand this disparity, this tremendous disparity in kind of racial demographics, specifically in an African-American presence in Louisville compared to the proportion of the US population that African-Americans represent. So a much smaller Black population in Louisville. And I am very intrigued, and the purpose of tonight's talk is to kind of think about why Louisville is not a more racially diverse place today, specifically what history can tell us about the answer to this question. I want to say this is an incredibly complicated question with an answer that would take way more time than we have to get in today. But it's also a question that's very, very, very worth asking and needs to be asked. But what we're going to do tonight is to bite off a very small part of this answer. And my argument for the answer to this question is that a little bit of how we can understand what's going on with those two graphs is looking at what happened in the 1920s, specifically kind of the ways that William Lofton and his experience here can reveal what life was like in Louisville in the 20s. Maybe before we jump in, one more quick interactive thing. This is on the fly. Could everyone just put in yes or no to let me know if you've read the article on Lofton? That would kind of help. I don't want to cover too much of what we covered before in the article that the museum put out. Oh, I'm seeing a lot of no's. This is great. And some yeses. Good. I will include some information. There is going to be some information on Lofton that's not covered. This framework's it's a little bit different than the article. I will encourage you to go read that, and I'll tell you where you can find that at the end of the talk. Okay. Thanks, everybody. I know it took us a little while to kind of get to the meat of the talk, but now we can kind of dive into part one. I also want to say this is going to be some tough history, some rather unpleasant things that we're going to be talking about. So just kind of bear with me, but also know we're looking at some of the darker sides of what has gone on in Colorado. So in the 1920s, the Second KKK was flourishing across the United States. For those of you who don't know, there's a First KKK after the Civil War. It kind of died out. It was mostly located in the South. And in the 1920s, or 1910s, 1920s, the Second KKK spread like wildfire across the US. It was not just located in the South, it was also located very popular in the Midwest and the West. And this new KKK still held on very strongly to its base foundation of white supremacy, but also incorporated into that message of hate, into their platform, some very, very strong anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic sentiments. So it modernized its message, basically increased who it was against. And it was very, very popular in Colorado in the 1920s. So by the mid-20s, Klan members in Colorado served as one of our federal senators, the mayor of Denver, the Denver chief of police, who was actually appointed by the mayor. The senator and the mayor were voted in, though, and they ran on openly pro-Klan positions, saying that they were themselves members of the Klan. And then, perhaps most significantly, the state of Colorado voted in Clarence Morley, who, as you can see, did not hide his Klan allegiance or his pro-Klan stance. And I don't think it's this image, although it might be, even led a 500-member Klan march to the state capitol in Denver. And this is an image of KKK march in Denver. So Colorado, by the mid-20s, again, 1925 is when Morley is elected, is very much a place that the Klan's influence, if not control, is felt. That doesn't mean that the Klan was also not strong outside of Denver, though. Many of those examples I just gave kind of focused on Denver. This is an image of the Boulder Clavern, which you might laugh, it's like Clavern spells with a K, but that's the name of a KKK group. Boulder founded the third Clavern in the state. So it went Denver, it went another city I can't recall, I can't recall. And then it went Boulder. There was tremendous Klan activity in Boulder County in beginning about 1923 or 24, and then kind of going until 26, pardon me, or so. But in the county, in Boulder, in the surrounding cities of Longmont, Louisville, Lafayette, kind of those cities around here that kind of form the outskirts of Boulder, Klan members did a number of things. As I mentioned, they founded the third Clavern in the state, so they were quick on the uptake, for better, well, no, for worse, just clear for worse. They operated the largest Klan newspaper in the state. So the Rocky Mountain American is a Klan newspaper that was run out of Boulder, or that Boulder circulated across the state. Repeatedly, and we have newspapers kind of documenting this, repeatedly Klansmen would kind of theatrically interrupt Protestant church services to donate money at the altar and then kind of leave the church service, all in their regalia and their robes, their hoods. But they were making their presence known and their support for Protestantism known. They marched, they held rallies and speeches. You can kind of see the newspaper here. They organized picnics and they coordinated, Klan sympathizers and Klan members coordinated to oust non-Klan friendly city councilors and local government officials. So the idea was to replace people who took a stand against the Klan with Klan sympathizers or Klan's men. And there was a women's auxiliary of the Klan in Colorado that also had a very strong membership. So this was kind of Protestant, some Protestant, Anglo-Saxon white men and white women who were joining the Klan and subscribing to its beliefs. But finally, and I cannot stress this enough, it wasn't just picnics, right? The Klan definitely both had an ideology of hate, but also actively worked to intimidate those they considered un-American. In Louisville and Lafayette, crosses were burned. That included crosses burned at Catholic churches or even in downtown Louisville. But who counted as un-American, it ranged. It included a number of people, both kind of immigrant families, specifically families of Italian heritage, anyone who practiced Catholicism, as well as a growing Latino population in the region. That being said, the Klan also, again, just because they were now anti-immigrant does not mean that they kind of gave up their earlier white supremacist beliefs. What I'd like everyone to do is actually take a moment and look this over. This is the precepts of the Ku Klux Klan here in Boulder County. This appeared in the Rocky Mountain American, that Klan newspaper, and it was published in 1925. So what I'd like to do is actually something similar to what we did with those graphs. Just look it over, sit with it, think about it, and then if you're comfortable in chat, I'd appreciate seeing your thoughts, your reactions, if there are questions, and then there are a couple of things that I want to highlight for the purpose of our talk. I see some comments, some kind of surprise about all the things that the Klan is for or against, but also a couple of people pointing out some of the individual points here, specifically the relationship between capital and labor. We're going to talk about that one, but I also see some comments about the role of women in the KKK. Again, yeah, there was a very strong women's auxiliary to the Klan here in Colorado. So, yeah, unfortunately. Okay. If there are any other questions about this, please pop them in the chat. But I want to kind of point out a couple of things. So one, as a couple of people actually identified in chat, the Klan remains, even in Boulder, or our area in which anti-immigrant sentiment was incredibly strong, but the Klan remains unabashedly white supremacist. There is no bones about it. Even when in the 1920s, our part of the state had a majority white population, belief in white supremacy was still very much here. And we'll talk about kind of the ways that that permeates and affects the way that Louisville can develop, but also what it looks like in the 20s. The other thing I want to point out is that the Klan is against foreign labor agitators, and that ties in with some of the labor conversation we're going to have. Typically, the way that kind of the mental calculus of the Klan worked, if you were a good laborer, and you typically, as a good laborer, were probably not foreign in any way, most likely were Anglo-Saxon. If you were a good laborer, you negotiated with capital, with kind of your employers, and you negotiated in good faith. They negotiated in good faith, and you never had to go on strike because the system was supposedly able to work all the time. So if you see, I've highlighted on the left and kind of the lower thing I highlighted, this prevention of unwarranted strikes by foreign labor agitators. Right above it, as a couple of people pointed out in chat, is this kind of weird line that says closer relationship between American capital and American labor. So the assumption was that you can have a close relationship between capital and labor because everyone should get along, kind of this utopian vision of white Anglo-Saxonism. oftentimes the way this calculus worked was that if there was a strike, it was blamed on foreigners. The idea was good laborers who are Anglo-Saxon and white would never agitate because they would just negotiate and everything would work out. So if there was a strike, it was almost always proof of outside agitators, oftentimes foreigners. And so there's kind of a hoop that the KKK could jump through to say, strikes were almost always, if not always, bad. And that's an important kind of stance that they're going to take. Okay. Now, this is going to be critical for our conversation about William Lofton. Again, the KKK in the area, specifically our local region, is very much against immigrants and Italian Americans, Latino population in the region. And we have examples of acts of terror against those populations here. But also, Black Coloradans living in Colorado during the 1920s were very aware of the white supremacist stance that the Klan still endorsed. So in 1925, the KKK is actively burning crosses outside of the Denver leader of the NAACP, just because he is suggesting integration on a number of fronts. But it's not just the Klan that is kind of subscribing to or using violence against Black Coloradans. As this article kind of shows, you have a Black family that is moving to what was primarily a white neighborhood in Denver, and somebody, possibly Klans members, but not necessarily, somebody inspired by kind of this normalization, this tacit approval of white supremacy, tries to blow up this family's home with them, or whoever was there. So I want it to be very clear that there is violence against Black Coloradans, that the Klan's kind of vitriol in the 20s, even though it does target immigrant groups that were present in the Louisville area, it also still is approving violence against Black Americans. So to recap, and then we're going to kind of dive into this a quick talk about labor, and then we'll talk about Lofton. By the mid-20s, the Klan controls a significant part of the state. Boulder County was very much a place of Klan influence, if not control. White supremacy is still a major plank of the Klan. And there are sympathetic non-Klan members in the region and throughout the state. And it's really, really critical to kind of recognize that even though a number of sex and financial scandals in the 1920s kind of in the 26, 27 kind of destroy political support for the Klan, the ideas that got the governor or the mayor of Denver or a Boulder Clavern founded still linger. So even as the Klan phases out pretty quickly, by 26 and 27, there is still tremendous belief in the anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Black sentiment that is kind of in the region. Okay, we're gonna now pivot. And I know this is gonna feel a little bit kind of yo-yo-y, but I promise it should all tie together. Okay, so part 2 now. We're gonna talk about labor and the 1927-1928 strike. I know that about half the people who attended were able to hear these strikes, so I'm gonna go quickly, but not too quickly. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and I will try to make sure I can talk about it. But here's kind of the gist of things. So once upon a time, the United Mine Workers, the UMW, was by far the most popular union in Louisville and the surrounding towns. In the 1910s, the UMW, and this is the UMW, the Union Hall that was in downtown Louisville, the UMW was the union of the area. They led the region through a strike that lasted from 1910 to 1914. That strike culminated in the Ludlow Massacre that you might have heard of, but they were a major union force in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, so 1900s and 1910s. As I said, they kind of led that strike. They didn't achieve most of their goals in that strike, and that is, there wasn't actually pay increases after the 1914 strike, and also they didn't achieve their larger goal of actually being recognized. So unions were not technically legal at the time. That is, the federal government did not recognize any right to collectively bargain. So employers did not have to recognize a union if they did not want. There was no legal requirement for them to do so. And unions were often fighting for that recognition so that they could collectively bargain and in many ways more equally negotiate with their employers instead of negotiating as an individual. Now, due to kind of the failures of the 1914 strike and some failed strike in the early 20s, membership in the UMW declined across the country. And you can kind of see it here, but in 1920, there had been almost 800,000, so about 775,000 UMW members nationally. By 1928, that drops to 80,000. So the UMW's problems were not just Colorado-based, they were national, they were myriad. But the important thing for us is that we know that the UMW declined and that the IWW kind of took its place. The IWW is the union that is going to be pushing for a strike in the 1920s. So the IWW is going to be pushing for this strike in 26, 27, and 28. You can kind of see a brief timeline of how it goes. So in 26 and 27, the IWW assigns to Colorado A.S. Embry. He's an organizer, and he begins in the southern fields, coal fields of Colorado, down by Pueblo, Trinidad area, to kind of just to talk to people and to see if they are interested in possibly going on strike to achieve some of the goals that coal miners had not yet achieved in other strikes. And he's doing this pretty quietly. He has, though, a lot of positive response. By the summer of 27, the IWW has enough support to open public offices in the southern Colorado coal fields. So Embry gets an office down in Wallensburg. In August of 27, so about a month or two after this office opens up, the IWW, they stage a walkout, and this was covered by Dr. Lee Campbell Hale in her talk, but they stage a walkout that protests the impending execution of Sacco and Vanzetti, two kind of immigrants that were charged with a lot of things back east, and who were executed for them controversially, to say the least. And so this impending execution is coming, and the IWW stages this walkout. But it is also a test to see if there are enough coal miners who would support the walkout to possibly support a strike. So they do that, and they think that that is true. So about a month after that, the IWW, because they believe that they have now enough support for a strike, they submit a plan for a strike to the Colorado Industrial Commission. After the Ludlow massacre, the state said that we have to have this commission that will kind of arbitrate the labor issues. And this commission was supposed to have all plans for strikes submitted to them so that they could tell you if it was going to be a legal strike or not. So they could say the strike was legal or it is not. So the IWW follows the rules, gives the commission, the CIC, 30-day advance notice, but their strike is rejected. The IWW believes that the commission will not recognize anything they do, that the commission is only going to kind of endorse any sort of strike that other unions that are a little less radical would put forth, unions like the AFL. So the CIC rejects the plan, but the IWW is kind of thinking that maybe they'll go forward with it. Then a month later, so a month and a half later, 4,000 coal miners meet in Lafayette. So everything that had been happening prior to this was happening in southern Colorado. Now we have miners in the northern Colorado coal fields also supporting the strike. And these miners meet and they vote to go on strike. So then they do. And that, in a nutshell, is how we get to, in October of 1927, almost all coal miners outside of a very few mines, significantly only one mine is left out of that strike in northern Colorado. But almost all coal miners go on strike in October of 1927. Again, I really encourage people to watch Dr. Lee Campbell Hale's talk. It's a lot more complicated, a lot more fascinating than kind of the bullet points I just ran through. But suffice it to say, the UMW goes away, the IWW comes, and they start a strike in 1927. Now, significantly, the IWW is different than the UMW. I apologize for all these acronyms. Is different because of a couple different strategies that they employ. So one strategy is that they very much are about training up local leaders. So they don't bring in a lot of our organizers from out of state. So Embry was one of the few ones that came from elsewhere. And his job was to identify local leaders and train them. In addition, they have, more so than the UMW, a commitment to ethnic and racial egalitarianism. Remember, this commitment is a commitment they are voicing at the same time that the Klan is now spreading throughout Colorado and throughout the country. So they are very much in opposition to the Klan. And they see their work as critical to building a much better America than the visions of America that the Klan is espousing. Now, it's worth noting, though, that these two strategies, which are highly successful, are slightly self-serving for the IWW in that one of the major critiques of the IWW is that they were outsiders. Remember, I said that the Klan often would argue that if you were an outsider, or that if there was a strike, it was the work of outsiders, the work of foreigners. That is often how the IWW was portrayed. They were portrayed as outsiders. They were portrayed as agitators who either were foreign or were coming from as far away as Chicago, and therefore were questionable. But the IWW, especially in this strike in Colorado, wanted to make sure that they were raising up local leaders, that they were operating at the grassroots level, and that their commitment to ethnic and racial egalitarianism was more than an abstract commitment, but was actually playing out. And by and large, it did in a number of different ways. Which brings us to William Lofton. We're going to kind of touch on some of the details that we covered in the article on Lofton, introduce a few new ways of looking at them, and then we'll have some time for some questions and some reflection. Now, the Loftons, William and his wife Lillian, they were coal miners. They were not outside organizers, although Lofton would become quite central and critical to the organization of the strike, especially in the northern parts of Colorado. They weren't labor organizers by trade. They might have had a history of activism. There's possible newspaper sources to suggest they might have been involved with the Colorado NAACP, but we couldn't quite tell if those names were their names in the newspaper records we could find. Regardless, we know that before they came to Louisville, they were not working as any sort of labor organizers. In the early 1920s, the Loftons were a coal mining family. They lived in Wyoming. And while they were in Wyoming, kind of 22, 23, 24, they had two children, Freeman and Anita. By the mid-20s, we're not quite sure when, probably about 1925, we know they moved probably to Broomfield. At the very least, we know that their son Melvin was born in Broomfield. And then we know that sometime in 1926, they moved to Lafarge. This is an image of a house they might have lived in. We're not quite sure which one it was. And this image of 815 Lafarge is definitely much newer. It's kind of mid-20th century at the earliest. But while they're on Lafarge, they have their fourth child. So the Loftons, by the time that they get here, they're still pretty young. He's only 35, and she's probably 29 when they move to Louisville in 1926. So they're a younger family. They are a family. They've got, by the time Wiley is born, 4 kids, and they're coal miners. Now, Lofton, like a lot of other coal miners, was not very satisfied with the way coal mining as an industry was working out. It was dangerous, pay was low, there was no recognition of union activity, and oftentimes one was taken advantage from. Now, Lofton, though, by the time he gets to Louisville, is going to be identified by the IWW, or perhaps he seeks them out. We don't know exactly how the relationship starts, but he joins the IWW and he becomes a pretty critical part of their strike organization effort. Now, we made this case in the article. Based on kind of the way that people talk about Lofton, he was most likely the most famous Louisville resident in the 1920s. You can kind of see. So, he steps up to organize the strike. He's working with Embry and other leaders, Adam Bell, Frank Palmer. There's a few names that will kind of come back later in the talk. But he kind of comes together with some of these other leaders in Northern Colorado, and they come up with a really novel solution to what had been a problem. During the 1910 and 1914 strike, the Colorado miners in the northern part of the state and the miners in the southern part of the state were kind of separate. There wasn't a lot of feelings of solidarity, a feeling like you're in this together. And so what they did is they would organize these car caravans in which a whole bunch of cars and a whole bunch of miners and their families would get together, and they would hop in their cars. They would put American flags everywhere, all over their cars, and they would drive through Louisville, Lafayette, Erie, Frederick, Firestone, all of these mining towns. They would sing songs. They would be talking in all their different languages, and then they would head south. And they would go and they would do the same thing in Trinidad and Pueblo and Wallensburg. And these car caravans, which Lofton was instrumental in kind of helping get off the ground, were critical to helping all coal miners in Colorado feel like they were on the same page, that they were in this together, which, as kind of the governor's response escalated, was quite important. But Lofton didn't just kind of organize behind the scenes. He was a phenomenal orator. So he traveled the state, speaking to crowds just like the one in this image that you can see. And he just wowed audiences left and right, speaking to hundreds and thousands of people at once, oftentimes striking miners and their families. He was quite witty. He has a couple of quips in newspapers in which he is very, very, very sharp on the uptake, responding to reporters who are trying to twist his words. And all of his work gets him written up in several national labor newspapers. So he, again, like making this argument that he is possibly our most famous president in the 20s. He is, I mean, people are talking about him left and right. People are very aware of the work that he is doing, as well as the work that other strike leaders are doing. But he is featured prominently in coverage nationally. And then in early November of 1927, Embry, remember the guy who came as the IWW organizer to kind of start the strike, Embry and several other high-level state leaders are arrested. So people who kind of were at Lofton's level, who had previously kind of been that second level of local organizers, they start to step up. And Lofton seems to have done that. So he takes on more authority and responsibility as the governor starts to crack down and arrest strike leaders. So Lofton is doing all of that. At the same time that is happening, we have, again, this government crackdown, which is starting to really, really escalate. On the left, we have here, actually we have an image of both or two Colorado governors, I believe pictured, photographed at the same desk, in this almost same pose, which I love. But on the left is Clarence Morley. Again, he's that KKK governor. While he was governor, he starts to kind of talk about, or to, how do I say this? I apologize. While he is governor, he has a lot of Klans members who had supported him. And he is looking for a way to kind of allow them to financially benefit from his elected office. So what he does is he forms a prohibition police, kind of a secret police. Remember, in the 20s, the prohibition is in effect. So he forms the secret police. And the secret police get to go around and kind of crack down on prohibition. And the secret police are sometimes called the Colorado Rangers, who also had a longer history in Colorado. But the Colorado Rangers under Morley are primarily Klansmen. And they are primarily people who benefit from who benefit financially, as in they're paid to go and kind of rough up immigrants and people of color from the governor's office. When Morley is not reelected in 1927, he is replaced by Billy Adams, who at first seemed to be a friend of labor. He tried to get himself elected, or he ran on a pro-labor platform. But as the strike is going on, and he is governor during the strike, as the strike is going on, as he is kind of dealing with decreasing funds and increasing frustration on the part of coal operators in the state, he reinstitutes the secret police, the Colorado Rangers, that he had initially disbanded when he became governor. So Morley starts the Colorado Rangers, or starts the Prohibition Police, and then Adams gets rid of them, and then a few months later, Adams brings them back once the strike is dire enough in his mind. Now, so remember that we have anti-strike law enforcement who are part of an organization that has a legacy of being affiliated, if not populated, by the Klan. The increasing militarization, the resumption of the Colorado Rangers, the use of state police, state militia police, kind of all erupts on November 21st, 1927, at the Columbine mine in northern Colorado. This violent episode was covered more in depth by Dr. V. Campbell Hale, but briefly, there was only one mine that was still operating throughout the strike in northern Colorado. It was the Columbine. It was a site of daily picketing by striking miners and their families. It was at Serene, Colorado, which is within walking distance of Louisville and Lafayette. Families would just kind of walk over. Serene doesn't exist anymore. It was a company town. So that mine site was the site of picketing, was the site of increasing escalation between miners and more members of state law enforcement who were brought in, some of whom were this secret police. The militarization of the site increases. You end up with machine guns. You can kind of see that in the headline here. You have airplanes that are equipped with bombs. You have law enforcement that are all equipped with 44 pistols, as well as tear gas. And in late November, everything kind of comes to a head. The picketing miners say that Adam Bell, who was one of those strike leaders and who was a friend of William Lofton, who Lofton worked with, was actually pulled over a fence, and then that law enforcement started beating him, and that picketing families and miners rushed through the fence to save Bell. State militia and law enforcement deny that and say, no, we were having rocks thrown at us and we opened fire because we were fearful for our lives. Regardless of how it started, what you end up with is unarmed protesters and picketers being gunned down by heavily armed members of law enforcement. 6 people are going to be eventually killed. 2 are killed outright, and then 4 more die of their injuries. And one of the people who was injured, and countless individuals are injured, is actually the neighbor of William Lofton. And this we'll get back to. His name was Henry Zarina. I apologize, Ernie Zarina. And he lived across the street from the Lofton family. He was shot through the head, but survived. And his story comes out in Lofton's. So this violent episode happens. And it actually marks a shift in public sentiment. So before this, most newspapers were pretty harsh against the striking miners. They did not kind of, they were not positive in their coverage of the strike. And this completely shifts everything. So now the miners have a lot of sympathy, although the governor continues to crack down. So what happens is the governor, Adams, with his secret police, who have a legacy of Klan involvement, if not Klan membership anymore, they start raiding IWW offices. This is the office down in southern Colorado. They continue to arrest leadership. Frank Palmer, I mentioned that he was a colleague of Lofton's, was arrested December 15th, so about 3 weeks after the violence at the Columbine occurred. He was giving a pro-union speech at a church in Longmont, and that public presentation was disrupted by law enforcement with bayonets. He was arrested at bayonet point and kind of hauled off. Embry, as I mentioned, had already been arrested. Almost everybody who was arrested was being moved around the state, partly because state officials believed that striking miners would break them out of jail, but also partly because by moving people around the state, you can kind of hold off charging them, letting them meet with their lawyers. So there was, at best, legal shenanigans going on, and at worst, a gross violation of civil liberties, as people were being arrested but then not charged, and held without being charged. So all of that is going on in the weeks after this very violent episode. which leads us to this night. And this is actually how I started the article. So on the night of December 11th, as you know, a couple weeks, a week and a half, 2.5 weeks after the Columbine violence, after maybe a couple months of government crackdown, after increasingly seeing his friends beaten and arrested and possibly killed. I don't know if Lofton was actually present at the Columbine. He oftentimes was traveling the state by that point. So he might have been there, he might not have. I haven't seen anything to suggest either reality. But on the night of December 11th, Lofton learns that he is going to be arrested. And he learns that possibly only, as this suggests, by a 15-minute window. What happens is, remember Ernie Zarina, the neighbor of Lofton's who had been shot in the head at the Columbine? He was recovering and living with his family across the street from the Loftons on Lafarge in Louisville. The possibly National Guard, that's what this article says, possibly secret state police. Other articles suggest different names for the law enforcement. They surround the Zarina's home. So they get the house wrong. They raid Ernie Zarina's home, who lives across the street from Lofton. And that is how we first heard about Lofton at the Louisville Museum, because we have an oral history from Ernie Zarina saying once, and he says this in the 1970s, he says, once my house was mistakenly raided by some strike police. As that is going on, is that, you know, the mistake is being made by law enforcement. It looks like Lofton escapes. And then from there, we know very little about him. Before we talk about what we do know, I'd like maybe to spend a minute to really kind of think about what might have been going on in his head. You know, and I really hope that we can kind of consider the reaction that he might have had, why he might have fled, because we don't ever know if he was arrested or not. We have no record of that. In fact, we have newspapers that suggest he continued to work on the strike in southern Colorado. We don't know if he returned to Louisville. We don't know if he was ever found. We know that in the 1930s, he and his family had moved to Denver. So William and Lillian moved to part of Denver. He, by 1930, lists himself in the census as a laborer. By the subsequent census, he is listed as a janitor. And then it looks like he passed away in the late 1930s. So he goes from being a very prominent labor organizer and a coal miner by trade to living in Denver being a janitor. Now, in terms of kind of the ways that we can use William Lofton to think about Louisville and the 1920s and the history of race and labor and how they intersect and the legacies they leave, I've kind of come to think of it in terms of, in some ways, a path not traveled. You know, there was a moment in the 1920s where everybody who lived on Lafarge was seeing Black residents in Louisville. This family lived there, and then they flee, possibly because William Lofton didn't just have all the violence against strikers in his mind, but also because he had all the violence that nighttime raids on Black men had kind of represented in Colorado and throughout the state. So I guess what I would hope that we consider is how there might have been a moment when Louisville could have had a different history, if somehow Lofton could have stayed, if their family could have stayed, if they could have remained prominent citizens, integral to trying to make Louisville, Colorado, and even the country in some ways a better place. But we don't. That didn't happen. And so in many ways, I feel like I'm forced to leave you with a sad story, one that in which the rosiest parts are what could have been, and not what happens. So with that, my talk is done. I'd love to open this up to questions. I apologize, it's 7:50, but I'm happy to stick around for as long as people would like. And if you would like to raise a question, what you can do is raise your hand using the raise hand function. And then Kaylin, one of my colleagues, will unmute you. You can voice your question, and I will do my best to answer it. You can also put a question in chat if you would like.
Okay, Jason, it looks like we have a question in the chat. Do you know how other strike leaders who were arrested were treated around this time in Colorado?
I think that's a great question. And I have often asked myself that in terms of whether Lofton legitimately felt, and I would say he could have, that maybe he would receive quite different treatment than some of his colleagues who were of a variety of ethnicities, but by and large were of ethnicities that were counting as white by the 1920s. So I think that, you know, most strike leaders were arrested, they were denied civil liberties. I have not run across stories, but Dr. Lee Campbell Hale, who has covered this strike in much greater detail than I have, might be aware of cases of physical abuse. I would say you're probably solidly going to encounter as an arrested strike leader emotional abuse, again, civil liberties being denied. But I have often wondered whether Lofton feared that he might not even actually be arrested. You know, this is a time period in America where you couldn't read a major newspaper, you know, maybe across a month and not come across a story of typically a Black man being lynched. Oftentimes lynching was happening in the South, but there's a very real physical fear. And, you know, I mean, I think that that the violence that was going on against Black Denverites and Black Coloradans would suggest that Lofton might have had those fears. I don't know. I truly don't know.
Okay, Vicky wants to know, are there any plans to have an exhibit on the KKK and or Lofton at the museum?
That is a great question. We love this story. And I think, so for other attendees who don't know, Vicky is one of our volunteers. Vicky, I look forward to having this be part of maybe the way that we can give tours. And we will have to kind of work together as a staff to decide what forms stories like this take in terms of exhibits, articles, programs, and tours. But I do hope that everyone listening thinks it's a pretty important story.
Great. I don't see any other questions. Christine says, so interesting. Glad that there will be a diversity task force in Louisville. Do you think that this story could affect how they think about Louisville?
I would hope that the takeaway from this talk can be that while we, as a city, state, country, very much need to think about the ways that systemic racism works today, contemporarily, part of that conversation also has to include historical forces and questions about how history can help us understand how we got to today. You know, I think that there are things in the world that can be made better today in terms of how the world works, but there's also a lot of history here. So.
Fred would like to know, are there any recommended readings on the history of the KKK in Colorado? What are your go-tos?
Without the internet in front of me, I'd have to look it up. I believe it's called Hooded Empire. I apologize. I'm typing as I do this. Kaylin, do any titles pop into your mind?
One that's pretty accessible to any reading level and or understanding of the KKK that I enjoy. I enjoyed reading was called Confederates in the Attic. It deals with the legacy of where the KKK came from and how it's kind of traversed the country and a lot of different political ideologies.
Yeah. So I think that wrestling with the legacy and the memory of the Klan is critical. Books like that. In terms of books that are as much focused on historical memory, the only Colorado-based book I know of, it is called Hooded Empire. It is by Robert Allen Goldberg, and it's a book that is oft-cited. So, if you looked it up, almost anything that, say, DPL or Denver Public Library writes in terms of blogs or things on the Klan is going to cite something like this. The other book I think is fascinating. It's called Women of the Klan, and it really kind of wrestles with the way that men and women, white men and white women, kind of worked together to push the Klan's ideology in the 1920s. And that is by Kathleen Lee. So it's also a very good book on the Klan. That is national though, and tends to focus a lot on places like Indiana and less on Colorado. So. Yeah.
Great. I don't see any other questions. Nobody wants to speak. Nobody's raised a hand.
That is fine. If people have questions, you're welcome to ask them. I will say, let me see. I think it's here. Oops. Okay. Yeah. I wanted to mention this, and I said that I would. So you can actually access back issues of the Louisville Historian on the museum's website. And the museum did put out a short video on the KKK in Louisville. And it features not only some newspaper primary sources, but I think critically, some oral histories from the 1970s. And we have some really heart-wrenching, but I think very, very important accounts of what it was like to be a target of Klan aggression in a place like Louisville. And those are primarily Italian mining families that are kind of being the targets of the Klan here. Okay. Any other questions, people?
I'm not seeing any.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you for being here tonight. Yeah, I really appreciate getting to kind of get the Lofton story out, but also kind of having reflections on race and labor and the ways that they work together to make Louisville what it is. So with that, I think we're going to kind of end the talk unless anyone else wants to pop in a question. But have a great evening. Thanks for hanging out with us. We really appreciate it. Oh, I do see a question about recording. So we are recording this and it will be available just like Dr. Lee Campbell Hale's talk on the museum's YouTube. So the same place that you can find our video on the KKK, you will be able to find both of the videos on or both of the talks that we've given on this topic. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. I think we are going to wrap things up with a couple logistical things on our end, and this has been great. Take care.